March 18, 1990. Augusta, Georgia. The sun had slipped past its peak, and neighborhoods settled into the rhythm of another Sunday. Families drove home from church, children played along sidewalks, and kitchens filled with the smell of late lunches. For most, it was a day that would dissolve into memory. But for one family, this Sunday became a wound that would never close. Two sisters, 15 years old, identical twins, disappeared without warning. They were there one moment, buying snacks at a corner store, laughing as they walked shoulder to shoulder, and then gone. Not a single reliable sighting after that. Not a trace. This is the story of Dannette and Jeannette Millbrook. Welcome to the Cold Case Archive, where forgotten cases are brought back into the light. If you believe every family deserves answers, and that time should never erase the truth, subscribe and join us in remembering. Drop a single word in the comments. Remember? It may seem small, but in cases like this, memory itself is a form of justice. Dannette Latonia Millbrook and Jeannette Latrice Millbrook were born on April 5, 1974. Identical twins, inseparable since birth. They were shy, sweet, protective of each other, and known to their family as good girls who stayed out of trouble. They shared everything: their walks to church, their seats in school, their plans for the future. Physically, they mirrored each other, with shoulder-length jerry curls and small scars near their navels from infant surgeries. But there were differences too. Dannette walked with a slight bow to her legs and, on that final day, wore a Mickey Mouse shirt with white jeans. Jeannette, dressed in a white turtleneck under a blue pullover and a beige skirt, had chosen stockings and sneakers. It's these details, mundane and ordinary, that live on in missing posters, the last snapshots the world holds of two teenagers who should have grown into adulthood together. To picture Augusta in 1990 is to see a city straddling two worlds, traces of its industrial past in brick mills and warehouses, and the close-knit feel of neighborhoods where everyone knew one another. Side streets were lined with modest homes, corner stores punctuated intersections, and Sunday afternoons were reserved for rest, family, and church. The Millbrooks lived on the south side of the city, an area where children walked freely between homes, schools, and shops. For two teenage girls, moving through their neighborhood was nothing unusual. But that ordinariness is what makes what happened next so haunting. The day started with church, as so many Sundays did. Afterward, the family grabbed lunch at a church's chicken. Later in the afternoon, the twins visited their godfather. With a looming move that would take them farther from their high school, they were worried about bus fare. Their godfather handed them a few dollars, just enough to get by. It was a small kindness, the kind families exchanged every day, never meant to be significant, but it became one of the final gestures of support they ever received in life. After that, the girls visited a cousin. They asked if she could walk them home, but she declined, not feeling safe to be out so late. At another stop, they visited their older sister, who had just given birth and was tied to her newborn. She too couldn't go with them. So the girls left together, just the two of them. At some point, the twins mentioned something to their mother that in hindsight chills the blood. They said a white van had been following them earlier that day. Their mother dismissed it in the moment, not wanting to scare them, perhaps hoping it was nothing. But that detail, the white van, would become one of the only fragments of suspicion, passed down in family testimony, unconfirmed but unforgettable. Around dusk, the girls walked into the Pump and Shop convenience store at the corner of 12th Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. They bought snacks, chips, candy, soda. The clerk remembered them. Another witness saw them leave the store together. That's it. That's the last confirmed moment in their lives. No one saw them reach home. No one reported seeing them forced into a car. No struggle, no shouts, no scattered belongings. Just two teenage girls walking into daylight, and then the silence of a trail that ends at the doors of a convenience store. Pause on that for a moment. Two 15-year-old girls, familiar streets, daylight hours. And then they're simply gone. It raises a haunting question for all of us. How can someone disappear so completely in a city full of eyes? When you think about this timeline, what's the one detail you find hardest to let go of? Is it the white van? The lack of witnesses after the store? Or the eerie ordinariness of that last purchase? Let me know in the comments. Sometimes, the detail that stays with you is the one that matters most. When the girls didn't come home that evening, their mother grew alarmed. The family started calling friends and relatives, driving familiar routes, and asking neighbors if anyone had seen them. They retraced steps, checked places the twins might have stopped, and begged for information. Those who've lived through it describe the night as chaos. Fear bleeding into exhaustion, phone calls unanswered, hours stretching out in dread. Their mother knew instinctively, her daughters weren't runaways. They were responsible girls. They had left everything behind, including their purses. Something was wrong. But when she reached out to the police, the family says the urgency wasn't shared. Reports suggest authorities initially treated the girls as runaways. The family was told to wait, to give them time to return. That dismissal in those first hours would haunt the family for decades. To understand the sting of that response, it helps to remember the era. In the 1980s and early 1990s, missing children cases were not handled the way they are today. The concept of stranger abductions was just entering the national conversation, and many police departments defaulted to assuming teens had left voluntarily. The first 24 to 48 hours, critical windows in any search, were often lost to that assumption. For the Millbrook family, that meant their cries for urgency met with delay. And in a case where the girl's last confirmed moment was already so fragile, every lost hour deepened the void. The image of the twins leaving the pumpkin shop has become the fulcrum of the entire case. Two girls buying candy, stepping back into the street, bags rustling in their hands. That's the picture frozen in time. And for more than 30 years, that ordinary moment has carried unbearable weight. Because after that moment, the world swallowed them whole. No clothing was found, no bodies, no notes, no credible sightings. Just absence stretching year after year. As darkness settled that night, the family was already searching, already pleading for help. But the people they turned to for protection were slow to respond. What unfolded in the days and weeks that followed wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a second tragedy, a story of how an investigation can falter, how evidence can slip away, and how a family can spend decades fighting to be heard. The Millbrook home grew tense as the hours passed and the twins didn't return. Their mother, Louise, knew immediately something was wrong. Dannette and Jeannette weren't the type to stay out without notice. They had no history of sneaking away, no signs of rebellion, and they had left behind everything. Their purses, their belongings, their schoolwork. For a mother, instinct can be louder than evidence. And her instinct screamed, her daughters hadn't chosen this. Something had happened. The family began calling relatives, retracing the walk, and reaching out to anyone who might have seen them. Neighbors shook their heads. Nobody had. By nightfall, the house was filled with panic, dread, and unanswered questions. They did what families are told to do in such moments. They called the police. But the answer they got wasn't what they expected. According to the family, the officers treated the twins' disappearance as a case of runaways. They were told to wait, to give it time. The implication was clear. The girls would turn up on their own. For Louise, this was devastating. She knew her daughters. They weren't runaways. They weren't in trouble. They hadn't planned to leave. And yet the system that was supposed to respond immediately with urgency and action seemed to fold its arms and wait. This perception of dismissal would become a cornerstone of the family's anger for decades. The first 24 hours in a missing persons case are crucial. It's the window when witnesses still remember what they saw, when surveillance footage, if it exists, hasn't been taped over, when physical evidence might still linger on the ground. Every hour lost is evidence slipping away. By treating the twins as runaways, those first critical hours weren't used to canvass neighborhoods, interview potential witnesses, or issue alerts. The family felt abandoned, forced to continue their own search with no backup. Relatives drove street after street, checking bus stops, stores, and neighborhoods. They knocked on doors and begged for information. They questioned anyone who might have seen two girls walking together that evening. But their efforts turned up nothing. Not a single confirmed sighting. No trail to follow. Just silence. For the family, the silence was terrifying. For authorities, it seemed to be confirming their theory that the girls had run off. Within weeks, the twins' case slipped into dormancy. According to later investigations, files were misplaced, tips weren't followed up, and eventually, the twins' names were even removed from the National Missing Persons Database, the very system designed to track the missing. Think about that. Two girls, officially listed as missing, simply disappeared from the records meant to keep them visible. For more than 2 decades, if you searched the national system for Dannette and Jeannette Millbrook, they weren't there. It was as if they had never existed. For the family, this wasn't just incompetence. It was erasure. And this raises a question I want to put to you. What do you think cuts deeper for a family, losing their loved ones or being told by the very system meant to protect them that their loss doesn't matter? Over the years, the Millbrooks' grief hardened into determination. Louise refused to let her daughters be forgotten. She spoke to anyone who would listen, she kept photos ready to hand to reporters, and she never let the story fade in Augusta's community conversations. But the lack of progress was crushing. Year after year passed without answers. Birthdays came and went with no candles lit. The twins' younger siblings grew into adulthood under the shadow of absence. The family recalls being told not to hope, not to press, to accept the likelihood the girls had chosen to leave. But that explanation never fit. These were two girls with close family ties, no warning signs, no preparations for running away. For their mother, it wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. It's important to remember the broader context of the time. In 1990, missing children of color often received less media coverage and less police urgency than white children in similar situations. This isn't speculation, it's a documented trend in studies of media and law enforcement practices of the era. Families of black children often had to fight harder for attention, for resources, and for their cases to be treated seriously. The Millbrook family lived that reality firsthand. As years stretched on, mistrust grew between the family and authorities. Each time a new detective rotated into the case, the family repeated the same story, the same details, the same pleas. But the outcome never changed. Leads went cold. Promises evaporated. By the late 1990s, the case was little more than a whisper in police archives. For many in Augusta, it wasn't even remembered. For the family, it was all-consuming. One of the most painful moments came when the family discovered that their daughters weren't listed in the National Missing Persons System. How could law enforcement track them if their names weren't even there? The explanation was never clear. Some accounts suggest the case was closed as runaways. Others imply it was clerical oversight. But whatever the reason, the effect was devastating. It meant that if Dannette or Jeannette had turned up anywhere, in hospitals, shelters, or even unidentified remains, there would have been no automatic connection back to Augusta. The girls were not invisible in reality, but they were invisible on paper. Stories like this don't just tell us about one family. They tell us about systems and about who gets heard and who doesn't. If you think stories like the Millbrook twins deserve to be remembered, share this video with one person who cares about justice. That's how cold cases stay alive. By word of mouth, by memory, by refusing to fade. By the time the 2000s arrived, the Millbrook twins had been gone longer than they had lived. 15 years old when they vanished, they would have been in their 30s by then. Their siblings became adults, their mother aged, and the grief became generational. But still, no one could answer the basic questions. Where did they go after leaving the pump-in shop? Why was their case allowed to wither before it even began? For 2 decades, the silence was suffocating. A disappearance with no suspects, no evidence, and for much of that time, not even an official listing in the system. But the Millbrook twins' story was not over. In time, journalists, podcasters, and advocates would rediscover their case. And when that happened, the truth about how their disappearance had been handled, or mishandled, came roaring back into the spotlight. The silence surrounding the disappearance of Jeannette and Dannette Millbrook could have swallowed the case forever. For more than 2 decades, the twin girls' names existed in a file so thin it was almost empty, stored in a box few ever opened. But silence can't bury love, and it was the persistence of their family that eventually forced the case back into the light. By 2013, after years of pleading and persistence, the Richmond County Sheriff's Office finally agreed to reopen the Millbrook case. For their mother, Mary Louise Sturgis, and the extended family who had carried the weight of unanswered questions for so long, it was a small but monumental victory. For the first time in over 20 years, there was acknowledgement that Jeannette and Dannette's disappearance deserved attention. Real, formal, investigative attention. The reopening of the case did not mean answers came quickly. It did not mean arrests or dramatic breakthroughs. But it meant the door was cracked open again, and for the Millbrook family, that sliver of light was enough to give them hope. Investigators began reviewing what little documentation remained, and the family, at last, felt like someone was listening. Still, a reopened file could only go so far. By the time investigators returned to it, witnesses had grown older, memories had faded, and leads that might have been strong in 1990 were now cold to the touch. The family knew the case could not survive on paperwork alone. They needed awareness. They needed people outside of Augusta to care. In 2017, another turning point arrived. A podcast called The Fall Line devoted its very first season to telling the story of the missing Millbrook twins. Hosted by Laura Norton and Brooke Hargrove, the podcast dug deeply into the case, interviewing family members, journalists, advocates, and local voices. For many listeners around the country, it was the first time they had ever heard Jeannette and Dannette's names. The impact was immediate. National audiences were stunned by the idea that two 15-year-old girls could vanish without a trace, and then vanish again from public memory. How could their case have been closed so quickly? How could a file on two missing children be little more than a handful of papers? The podcast didn't just ask these questions, it forced them into the open. One of its most shocking revelations was the state of the original case file. As advocates and podcast hosts reviewed it, they found it was startlingly thin, with critical details missing. There were no comprehensive interviews with witnesses, no extensive canvassing records, no detailed tracking of leads. For two missing children, the level of documentation was alarmingly low. That discovery fueled outrage and reinforced the Millbrook family's long-held belief. Their daughter's case had never been treated with the seriousness it deserved. The podcast also reintroduced details that had been floating for years, like reports of a man in a white van seen in the area around the time of the disappearance. While never confirmed, the story became one of several threads investigators had to revisit. Was it connected? Or was it just a rumor magnified by the absence of official answers? No one could say for certain, but in a case with so little to go on, even the faintest lead carried weight. Beyond individual leads, the podcast exposed something larger: the deep disparities in how missing children cases are handled. Two black teenage girls from a working-class neighborhood had not received the kind of urgent, national coverage that often surrounded missing children from wealthier or whiter communities. In the early 1990s, before the explosion of the internet and the rise of instant alerts, media attention was already uneven. And for Jeannette and Dannette, that inequity was devastating. Listeners across the country responded with outrage, disbelief, and empathy. Online discussions multiplied. Advocacy groups for missing children amplified the twins' story. Social media posts called attention to the case, generating momentum that had been absent for decades. For the first time since 1990, Jeannette and Dannette's names were circulating far beyond Georgia. For the Millbrook family, the sudden wave of attention was bittersweet. On the one hand, they were finally being heard. On the other hand, the pain of knowing how little had been done, and how much time had been lost, cut deep. Their sister, Shanta Sturgis, emerged as one of the most important voices during this period. She had been just a child herself when her sisters vanished, but she grew up carrying their absence as a permanent shadow. Now, as an adult, she was the family's most vocal advocate. In interviews, she spoke plainly: her sisters deserved justice, and their case deserved the same level of commitment afforded to any other missing children. Her advocacy made her a central figure in the story. Every microphone, every camera, every interview became a platform to remind the world: Jeannette and Dannette matter. The renewed spotlight also placed new pressure on local law enforcement. If national audiences were listening, if thousands of people were now asking questions, then silence from the sheriff's office was no longer an option. Investigators began re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining documents, and attempting to retrace the few leads that still existed. It was painstaking and progress was slow, but the effort itself marked a dramatic change from the decades of inaction. If you're watching this and feel the weight of their family's struggle, take a moment to share this story. Awareness has power. Every share, every conversation keeps Jeannette and Dannette from fading back into silence. As media coverage grew, the case of the Millbrook twins became more than just a missing persons file. It became a lens into broader issues of race, class, and justice in America. Journalists and advocates began pointing out the patterns. Missing children of color were often overlooked, their families left without the same resources, attention, or urgency. The Millbrook twins case was not the only one, but it was one of the starkest examples. For Louise, their mother, this was a painful truth. She had spent years insisting her daughters were not runaways, that something terrible had happened to them. Yet for so long those words had been dismissed. To finally see others recognize what she had always known was both validating and heartbreaking. The family continued to push forward. They spoke at events, appeared in interviews, and joined forces with advocacy organizations. Each appearance, each article, each podcast episode was another step in keeping the case alive. The podcast The Fall Line didn't solve the case, but it reignited it. It pulled the twins' story out of obscurity and forced it into the national conversation. And with that came the hardest reality of all. Even with the case reopened, even with the national attention, the central question remained the same. What happened to Jeannette and Dannette Millbrook on that March day in 1990? Every interview, every tip, every whispered rumor seemed to circle back to that same empty space. A space where answers should have been documented long ago. But for the Millbrook family, there was no choice but to continue. They had waited too long, fought too hard, and carried too much to turn back now. And so, the investigation moved forward, step by step, guided not by the weight of evidence but by the force of determination. The file was reopened, the questions re-asked, the leads retraced. The case that had once been forgotten was alive again, carried forward by the voices of a family, a community, and a growing number of people across the nation who refused to let Jeannette and Dannette be forgotten. The story of Jeannette and Dannette Millbrook had already traveled a long and lonely road by the time it began to attract broader attention. What started as a family's desperate plea had, over decades, become a symbol of how cases could be neglected, misfiled, or forgotten. By the late 2010s, however, the conversation around their disappearance had shifted. Awareness had broadened beyond Augusta, and with that broader attention came both new possibilities and fresh frustrations. The case's trajectory after its 2013 reopening showed how tenuous progress can be when time has already eroded so much. When detectives first agreed to re-examine the file, it offered a sliver of validation to Mary Louise Sturgis and her family. Their daughter's disappearance would no longer be treated as a closed matter. Investigators noted the case was active again, and for a family that had spent years knocking on doors and repeating the same facts, the reopening felt like an overdue acknowledgement. But reopening did not magically restore what had been lost. Time had thinned memories, changed neighborhoods, and allowed important details to fade. Even so, the reactivation of the file created an opening for other forces to press the case into the public consciousness. Advocacy groups, journalists, and community members took hold of that opening and began to amplify the twins' story in ways that local efforts alone had not managed. One significant development in that amplification was the involvement of national missing children organizations and the creation of age-progressed images intended to help the public recognize what Dannette and Jeannette might have looked like decades later. Those images, stark, haunting, and humanizing, served a dual purpose. They reintroduced the sisters as living persons who might still be found, and they reminded a national audience that two girls had vanished without satisfactory answers. Local advocates and family members also stepped up their outreach. Rather than implying large, formal rallies, neighbors, grassroots organizers, and relatives organized awareness efforts. Smaller, persistent actions that included distributing flyers, speaking at community gatherings, and urging local media to keep the story alive. These were the sort of sustained, community-driven measures that don't always make headlines but slowly change the narrative around a case, pushing it from the margins toward the center of public attention. The Fall Line podcast, which devoted its first season to the Millbrook twins, played a particularly powerful role in bringing the case far beyond Augusta's city limits. The show framed the disappearance not simply as an isolated tragedy but as an example of broader patterns. Missing young people of color receiving less attention, fewer resources, and far less media coverage than other cases. The podcast's interviews with family members, advocates, and local reporters put faces and voices to the file and forced a national audience to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that not all missing children receive the same level of urgency. Listener response was immediate and sizable. Online conversations multiplied, social posts were shared widely, and the case began circulating across forums and community groups that had never heard the twins' names before. Public attention brought new callers and tips to law enforcement and renewed pressure on officials to be transparent about what was being done. That pressure, in turn, had an effect on how authorities publicly discussed the case. In interviews and public statements in the late 2010s, Richmond County law enforcement acknowledged that the case had been re-examined and that tips were being reviewed. They explicitly stated the case remained open. Those acknowledgments were meaningful, not because they guaranteed a breakthrough, but because they signaled a willingness to respond to public scrutiny and to position the disappearance as an ongoing, active investigation rather than a long-closed file. Yet, the nature of much of this activity remained opaque. Public statements from investigators were often limited, emphasizing that details could not be released without compromising the integrity of the investigation. That constraint is understandable and common in active investigations. Still, to the family and to advocates, the cautious public posture could feel like frustration, an echo of the past when they had been told to wait as the crucial early hours slipped away. A central piece of the renewed scrutiny was the question of why the original case file had been so thin. Investigative reporting and the podcast work revealed that essential documentation was sparse. If thorough interviews and canvassing had been completed in 1990, the record did not reflect it. This lack deepened frustration and suspicion. Had the case simply been neglected, or had procedural failures left the family without the records that might have helped future investigators? Whatever the reasons, the effect was the same. Later reviewers had too little to work with. Public reaction to those revelations often centered on the broader question of media and institutional bias. Researchers and journalists often refer to the phenomenon as missing white woman syndrome, shorthand for how predominantly white, often middle-class missing persons cases tend to receive disproportionate media attention, while missing people of color and those from marginalized communities receive far less sustained coverage. While this term is contested and complex, its use in reporting around the Millbrook case served to situate the twins' disappearance within documented patterns of disparity. Listeners and readers began to ask hard questions. If two teenage girls from Augusta could be largely forgotten, how many others had suffered the same fate without attention? For the family, the attention was a mixture of relief and renewed pain. On good days, it meant more people knew the twins' names and more eyes were watching for any clue. On hard days, it meant retelling the story to new audiences, reliving trauma in interviews, and hearing the same questions that had been asked for 30 years. Their persistence, however, was unwavering. Shanta Sturgis, who had grown from a child in a family in crisis to the family's primary public advocate, became the voice that kept the sisters' story present in the media. Her interviews were direct and unflinching, and in every appearance she made one plea consistent: if you know something, please come forward. The role of advocacy groups, reporters, and podcast listeners in drawing attention to cold cases is an evolving and complicated dynamic. On the one hand, these forces can breathe life back into neglected investigations, reward families with visibility, and spur law enforcement agencies into action. On the other hand, they can create unrealistic expectations about quick resolutions or amplify unverified tips that consume investigator time. Throughout the Millbrook case, family members and advocates sought to balance these dynamics, pushing hard for attention while insisting on accuracy and restraint from armchair theorists. A notable effect of the renewed spotlight was that some previously unreported or underinvestigated leads resurfaced. Individuals who had not been willing or able to come forward in earlier decades found the courage to speak with reporters or law enforcement, sometimes motivated by the broader publicity. Tips trickled in from different years and sources, none of them definitive but all of them adding small pieces to a larger mosaic of possibilities. Law enforcement responses to these new tips were necessarily careful. Public statements emphasized that tips were being reviewed, that the case was being investigated, and that the sheriff's office would follow credible leads. Detectives acknowledged the practical limitations imposed by the passage of time. Memories fade, potential witnesses relocate, and physical evidence, if any had ever been collected, can degrade or disappear. Still, the very act of reopening dialogue and re-examining records constituted a shift from decades of dormancy. For observers and advocates, this renewed but methodical approach underscored an uneasy truth. Sometimes the best outcome of a public campaign is not immediate closure but the preservation of the case as something that continues to be worked on. When the public keeps the story alive, institutions are reminded that the case matters. That reminder can lead to increments of progress, new interviews, fresh forensic analysis if material exists, and sustained pressure to pursue leads rather than consign them to a drawer. Another effect of wider awareness was the way the twins' story became part of national conversations about justice and equity. When media outlets covered the Millbrook disappearance, they often paired the narrative with broader reporting on how missing people of color receive less attention. The case therefore functioned both as a specific tragedy and as a case study in structural problems. That dual role increased its reach. The Millbrook story became relevant to audiences who care about civil rights, criminal justice reform, and media representation. Yet even as the case gained new listeners and readers, the family's central request remained simple and specific. If you have information, tell law enforcement. For decades, their message had been the same, and it would remain so. Publicity could create pressure and possibility, but it could not replace a credible tip or an incontrovertible piece of evidence. As the Millbrook case moved through its renewed life, supporters built networks to sustain attention. Small community gatherings, online memorials, and repeated media mentions ensured the twins' names circulated. These were not grand spectacles. They were consistent reminders that two teenagers had been taken from their family and their community. That consistency mattered more than flash-in-the-pan coverage. The family's long-term advocacy showed that sustained focus, even at a grassroots level, can reshape the long tail of a cold case. In practical terms, what did this renewed attention produce? It restored the twins' presence in national missing persons systems, re-established the case's active status, and brought new tips and scrutiny to bear. But it also underscored the limits of publicity. Awareness alone does not equate to evidence. Investigators still faced the same core problem. An interruption of the early investigatory window in 1990 had left a hole that time made deeper. Still, the comeback from obscurity mattered. It meant that the names Jeannette and Dannette would no longer be easy to forget. That visibility made it more likely, however slightly, that someone somewhere who had seen or known something would recognize the significance and step forward. In cold case work, sometimes the smallest memory, a partial license plate, a passing remark, a detail once considered irrelevant, can shift an investigation. The family continued to press for clarity and for resources. They worked with journalists to ensure reporting stayed grounded in fact, and they urged listeners and readers to consider the real human cost of a file that had been allowed to wither. Their message was not political, it was a mother's plea and a sister's insistence. Remember our daughters and help us find out what happened. As the 2020s progressed, the Millbrook case stood as a testament to both the cruelty of neglect and the power of persistence. It showed how a small community's memory could be amplified into national attention, and how that attention could prod institutions to act, if only to the degree that time and missing records allow. And through it all, the family continued to ask the same simple, unrelenting question. Where did Jeannette and Dannette go on that ordinary March afternoon in 1990? The renewed attention had not produced the answer, but it had kept that question where it belonged, in the public eye, in the hands of investigators, and on the lips of a community that refused to let two sisters be erased from history. When a case lingers for decades without resolution, theories begin to fill the silence left by the absence of answers. For the Millbrook twins, that silence has been deafening. In the absence of official breakthroughs, friends, family, advocates, and even strangers have pieced together ideas about what could have happened that day in March of 1990. These theories do not replace evidence, nor do they carry the weight of official findings. But they represent the human effort to make sense of what has remained senseless for more than 3 decades. The starting point for many of these theories is the last confirmed detail. Jeannette and Dannette were seen leaving a convenience store on 12th Street. From there, the trail disappears. What lies between that exit and the family's home has been the subject of endless speculation. One of the earliest theories was also the simplest, that the girls had chosen to run away. In the 1990s, this idea was floated in official records, and at one point it was even cited as a reason the case was closed. But anyone who knew the twins or their family rejected it outright. By all accounts, the girls had not shown signs of planning an escape. They left behind their belongings, their clothes, their school materials, and their personal treasures. They had younger siblings they helped care for. And most importantly, they had no money or transportation. To those who loved them, the idea that both would vanish by choice, in tandem, and never resurface in more than 3 decades defied reason. Today, even investigators have distanced themselves from that early runaway theory, acknowledging its flaws. Another set of theories focuses on abduction. The most common version suggests that the girls may have accepted a ride, willingly or unwillingly, from someone they knew or at least recognized. Augusta in 1990 was not an enormous city, and the girls had lived their lives there. If someone familiar pulled up in a car and offered them a ride, it would not have been strange for them to accept. In such a scenario, what began as trust could have turned into tragedy. Supporters of this theory point to the absence of signs of a struggle near the convenience store. Something had happened right outside, it might have drawn attention. But if they stepped into a vehicle, the act could have gone unnoticed. Linked to this is one of the most frequently cited claims in public discussions, that a white van may have been involved. This claim surfaced years after the disappearance, with some community members recalling that a white van had been seen in the area around the time the twins vanished. But no official report has ever confirmed such a vehicle's involvement. No license plate, no owner, no driver has been identified. In cases like these, it's important to separate remembered rumors from documented fact. The white van remains a piece of speculation, possible but unsubstantiated. Another theory centers on the possibility of trafficking. Advocates who have studied patterns of missing children note that young girls of color are at higher risk of being drawn into trafficking networks. Some family members and supporters have said they fear this may have happened to Jeannette and Dannette. While no evidence has confirmed this outcome, the idea reflects a plausible danger in communities where young people can vanish into systems that thrive on invisibility. If this were the case, it might help explain why no trace of the girls has ever been recovered. Yet without documentation or confirmed sightings, the trafficking theory remains in the realm of possibility rather than proven reality. There are also darker suspicions that someone in the community, perhaps even someone with proximity to the girls, could have been involved. Families in unsolved cases often wrestle with questions about who could have had motive or opportunity. Was it a stranger? A passing predator? Or was it someone they might have trusted? A family friend, a neighbor, someone with enough familiarity to lower the girls' guard? Investigators have never released names publicly, and without concrete evidence, such suspicions remain painful possibilities rather than confirmed leads. Perhaps the most haunting element of the Millbrook case is the persistent absence of evidence. No clothing, no personal effects, no remains, no confirmed sightings. In many missing person cases, families at least receive fragments: a wallet, a shoe, a report of someone seen in another state. Here there is nothing. For some, this absence supports the trafficking theory. If the girls were intentionally hidden, the goal would be to erase their presence. For others, the absence suggests something abrupt and final, an act of violence that left no trace. Both interpretations remain speculative. The family themselves have voiced their own beliefs cautiously but consistently. Louise Sturgis, their mother, has said repeatedly that she never believed her daughters ran away. Shanta, their younger sister, has shared her conviction that someone took them. They do not claim to know who or why, but they are firm in rejecting the runaway explanation that closed the case for decades. Their advocacy is not about pointing fingers without proof, but about keeping the pressure on investigators to seek out any lead, however small. Media coverage of the case in the late 2010s and early 2020s brought these theories to wider audiences. Podcasts, true crime blogs, and even televised reports highlighted the possibilities, always with the caveat that they remain unproven. In some ways, this broader airing of theories has been helpful. It reminds listeners that unsolved cases are dynamic. Possibilities shift as new tips surface, and no single theory should be treated as fact unless supported by evidence. But in other ways, it has been challenging for the family, who must constantly hear strangers dissect what might have happened to their loved ones. That can feel invasive even as it helps spread awareness. It's also important to note how the context of Augusta in 1990 has shaped these theories. This was a city facing economic challenges, community divides, and crime rates that made abduction tragically plausible. The fact that two girls of color could vanish and be quickly written off as runaways reflects not just one family's tragedy but a systemic failure. That failure leaves theories as the only available tools in the absence of documented facts. For cold case investigators, theories serve as working frameworks. They are not solutions, but they are starting points. Investigators may ask, does a tip about a vehicle fit into the abduction framework? Does a story about a suspicious individual align with the trafficking theory? Each possibility becomes a lens through which new information can be tested. The challenge, of course, is that after 3 decades, most theories remain untested and unproven. Among the most painful realities for the Millbrook family is that the community itself holds fragments of the truth. Someone saw something, heard something, knew something. In all likelihood, that person may still be alive today. The family has expressed this belief repeatedly, that there are people in Augusta who know more than they have ever shared. For them, the theories are not abstract. They are reminders that the missing link in this case may be a memory, a recollection that seems small but could prove pivotal. Family members have said as much in interviews. Someone knows what happened and they have simply not spoken. For outsiders, it may be tempting to cling to a single explanation. But in truth, every possibility carries weight until evidence rules it out. Did the girls encounter a predator in the community? Were they swept into trafficking? Did someone close to them betray their trust? Or is the explanation something entirely unforeseen, hidden behind the silence of time? Each question reflects a possible path, and each remains open. As the case continues to live in public awareness, these theories are not just speculations, they are calls to action. Each possibility reminds us that evidence might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered. Each rumor or recollection could still be cross-checked. And each theory represents the human refusal to accept silence as the final answer. The Millbrook twins story has endured precisely because people, from their family to strangers listening across the country, refused to let the case be closed again under the weight of uncertainty. And so, more than 30 years later, the questions still echo. What happened to Jeannette and Dannette after they left that store? Who saw them next? And why in all these years has no one been willing or able to provide the truth? Until those questions are answered, the theories will remain, not as distractions but as reminders that somewhere buried in rumor, memory, or silence, lies the truth of what really happened to the Millbrook twins. More than 30 years have passed since Dannette and Jeannette Millbrook walked out of that Augusta convenience store and disappeared into silence. 3 decades of unanswered questions. 3 decades of grief carried by a mother who never stopped searching, and a sister who grew up under the weight of their absence. And yet, despite the time, the case of the Millbrook twins has never truly faded. Their story lives on, not just in Augusta but across the country, because of the tireless efforts of family, advocates, journalists, and everyday people who refuse to let the twins be forgotten. For Louise, their mother, and Shanta, their younger sister, life became defined by the twins' absence. Each birthday that passed, each holiday that came and went without them, was a wound that never healed. Louise never accepted the early dismissals by authorities. She never believed her daughters had run away. From the beginning, she fought to have their case recognized, to keep their names spoken. Over the years, she contacted police departments, media outlets, and anyone who might listen. Shanta, who was just 12 when her sisters disappeared, eventually grew into the family's most visible advocate. As she entered adulthood, she carried their memory into the public eye. She appeared on podcasts, documentaries, and at community events, always repeating the same message. Her sisters mattered, and they deserved justice. For Shanta, the fight was personal, but it was also about principle. As she once explained in interviews, no child should ever be forgotten. Not because of their race, not because of their neighborhood, not because authorities once dismissed their case as unworthy of serious investigation. In 2013, after years of being closed, the Millbrook twins case was officially reopened by the Richmond County Sheriff's Office. For the family, it was a small victory, a recognition that the disappearance of Dannette and Jeannette had never been solved, and that perhaps, after so much time, progress could finally be made. But reopening a decades-old case is no simple task. Witnesses' memories fade. Records are lost. Leads go cold. And yet, the symbolic weight of the reopening mattered. It showed the community that the twins' story was not over. Shanta met with detectives, supplied them with everything the family had collected, and kept pushing for updates. Each time the investigation seemed to stall, she spoke out again, demanding answers. The story of the Millbrook twins began gaining wider attention in the late 2010s, thanks in part to media amplification. The podcast The Fall Line dedicated multiple episodes to the case, carefully walking listeners through the timeline, the missteps, and the unanswered questions. Their coverage was more than storytelling, it was advocacy, shining a spotlight on a case that had once been nearly invisible. National outlets picked it up. Newspapers and television reports revisited the case. The twins' faces appeared in online articles and social media campaigns. For the first time in decades, the Millbrook twins were not just remembered locally, they became part of a broader conversation about missing children in America, particularly missing black children whose cases had too often been ignored. The Millbrook case is not just the story of 2 girls who vanished. It is also a story about disparities in how cases are handled. Studies have shown that missing children of color often receive less media coverage than their white counterparts. Police departments, stretched thin or influenced by bias, may devote fewer resources. Communities may not rally as strongly. The result is that cases like the Millbrook twins can slip through the cracks. By keeping the twins' names alive, their family and supporters have also raised awareness about these systemic issues. Their case has become a symbol, not just of one family's pain, but of a larger problem in how missing children are treated in America. In Augusta, the twins' story remains a touchstone. Community members still recall the headlines from 1990, the rumors that spread, the unanswered questions. Some wonder if someone in the city still carries the truth, if a witness has stayed silent, if a suspect was overlooked, if a detail was missed. From time to time, occasional tips still come in. They may be vague. They may not lead anywhere. But each one is a reminder, people haven't forgotten. And the family believes strongly that someone, somewhere, does know something. Perhaps a memory they've pushed aside. Perhaps a truth they've hidden for decades. If that person ever steps forward, it could change everything. Living for decades without answers is its own kind of torment. For Louise, every day was marked by the absence of her daughters. For Shanta, every stage of life, graduations, birthdays, milestones, was shadowed by the reminder that her sister should have been there. This grief is compounded by uncertainty. Without knowing what happened, the family has had no closure. Were the twins taken? Were they harmed? Are they still alive somewhere? These questions linger, gnawing at the family's peace. But despite it all, they continue to hope. They continue to believe that the truth can emerge, even after so many years. And this is where you, the viewer, come in. Cold cases are not just stories, they are living puzzles with pieces scattered across communities, records, and memories. Sometimes all it takes is one person to speak up. So we ask you, what do you think happened to Dannette and Jeannette Millbrook? Do you believe they may have been abducted? Do you think the runaway theory, despite being dismissed by the family and later investigators, deserves reconsideration? Could they have been pulled into something darker, like trafficking, as some advocates have speculated? Or is there another explanation altogether, hidden in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes discussion leads to new insights. And even if it doesn't solve the case, it helps keep the twins' names alive. Today, the Millbrook twins remain missing. Their case remains open but unsolved. Their family remains vigilant. The legacy of their story is one of resilience in the face of neglect. It is a reminder of how important it is to listen to families, to treat every disappearance with seriousness, and to recognize that justice delayed is justice denied. But it is also a story of hope. Hope that after all these years, the silence can be broken. If you've made it this far, thank you for honoring the memory of Dannette and Jeannette Millbrook. Their story deserves to be told and retold until answers come. If you want to see more deep dives into unsolved mysteries and long-forgotten disappearances, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And remember, behind every headline is a family waiting for answers. Together, by keeping these stories alive, we make sure they are never forgotten.